My mother was born at the end of the Spanish flu, and then she grew up like the rest of her generation with the Depression. Then when she turned 19, the Second World War broke out, and she saw all her friends go off to war. So you talk to her about the pandemic, she goes, you know, this is just another crisis. Those of us who haven't lived through generational trauma might think that this is the worst thing that has happened in the history of the world. And she's going, yeah, you had to spend 6 months in your basement watching Netflix. Try 6 years of war and losing everyone you ever loved. The day she was born, Babe Ruth got a hit for the New York Yankees. She was born 7 years before they first sold sliced bread. My mother turned 102 in September, and she's still here. At the same time, my family and I think there's a pretty good chance that when the world ends, the last two people on earth will be my mother and Keith Richards.
I'm Peter McCully. That's Jack Knox, author and columnist. We'll talk about his latest book, Fortune Knox Once, when Today in BC continues.
Hey, it's the Moj, Bob Marjanovic. Join me on the Moj on Sports podcast on Black Press Media at todayinbc.com. Listen into conversations with well-known athletes and celebrities as we look behind the scenes at these successful people. Listen in to the Moj on Sports podcast on todayinbc.com. You'll also find the Moj on Sports podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, YouTube, and Google Podcasts, as well as mojonsports.com.
Thanks for joining us today, Jack.
Thanks for having me.
You were raised in the BC interior. Tell us what life was like for young Jack growing up.
It was like growing up in a Norman Rockwell picture. I grew up about 10 kilometers outside of Kamloops in what was known as a Veterans Land Act neighborhood. They made land available cheap to veterans of the Second World War, so as a consequence of that, it was all single-family houses occupied by the same family. There'd be dad, who was a war veteran, mom, and a whole bunch of kids, and it was just duplicated across the entire neighborhood. Nobody had any money, but nobody was starving either. So it was just a bunch of the same people.
What did you do for fun as a young guy?
Chased snakes? No. Just the normal kid stuff. There weren't a lot of organized activities, but you joined clubs and you played hockey outside in the winter if you could. And yeah, it was just a nice place to grow up.
Was your family an influence on your decision to become a reporter? What drew you into it?
I became a reporter almost without thinking about it. I grew up in a family where education was important, doing the right thing was important, values were important. We weren't great athletes, we weren't a lot of things that a lot of people think of as priorities, but you were going to be engaged in the world and you were going to be a good citizen. That was important. Reading was important. We all grew up reading the newspaper every day. I always enjoyed writing. I did that all the way through school. I went into college without an idea of what I really wanted to do, but I ended up as the editor of the college paper just for fun. And I remember got out of school one summer and needed a job, and they weren't hiring forest firefighters, which is one I really wanted. So I wandered into the Kamloops News with my paper bag full of clippings and said, I think it'd be great if you gave me a job. Fortunately for me, they'd had a reporter who'd burst her appendix the day before, and they needed a warm body right now. Anybody breathing, they wanted right now for 6 weeks. And that's how I got my foot in the door.
At that time, were you writing Humour's articles, hard news, opinions?
No, it was just straight ahead news reporting. I think the first story I remember doing was about a cow that had wandered out of the stockyard in Kamloops into the middle of the street on a hot August afternoon and expired right then and there. And there was a dispute over who was going to deal with the cow. Was it going to be the railway or the stockyard or the city? And the cow just got hotter and bloated more and more, and they sent the rookie down. And I hit that story like it was Watergate. But it was a great place to work in that it was run by a guy called Mel Rothenberger, was the editor. And he became a big influence on me because he was the guy who impressed upon us that small-town journalism didn't have to be small-time journalism. He was one of those editors who would do the right thing instead of the easy thing. That became impressed upon me early. I don't always do the right thing instead of the easy thing, but I think it's a swell idea.
You ended up in other places working for newspapers, Saskatchewan, on Vancouver Island, obviously.
After I got married, my wife and I went to England for about a year and a half just for an adventure and started applying when it was time to come back to Canada, started applying for jobs. And the first place that wanted to hire me was the Regina Leader-Post, which I loved working at, the paper itself, and I loved people in Saskatchewan. They were down to earth and really knew their community inside out. But man, those winters were long and cold. And I think my wife got to the point where she said, you know what? I'm going back to BC. You can come with me or you can stay here, which I took as a hint. So we ended up in Campbell River, where I was the editor of the Campbell River Courier Islander for a year, then eventually made my way down to Victoria in 1988 and started work at the Times Columnist there.
Well, you certainly got a taste of some fantastic places to live, the mountains, the prairies, the ocean.
Living on Vancouver Island, sometimes we take it for granted. You get on the ferry, and you can always tell who lives on the island because you've got the German tourists have got their cameras out there. They're taking pictures like crazy. If you're heading towards Tsawwassen, you can see all the Albertans crying because they have to go back to the wrong side of the Rockies. But then you look at the people who are just reading their books while the world's best scenery is going by like a moving postcard and go, oh, those are the guys who live here.
I'll never forget it. When I landed in Vancouver, stayed with my brother for a couple of days, and I was heading to Salt Spring to see my mother. I got on the big ferry, and I was a foot passenger. And I went up to open seating. About 80% of the people all had their noses in a book. I was not used to that. It just took me by surprise.
Yeah,
It's a reading population in British Columbia.
it is, and I'm fortunate. I say, all power to them. Forget the scenery, read books.
And you've written your fourth book, which is a compilation of some of your columns, some humorous, a few serious, some quirky. How do the ideas and the stories come to you?
Sometimes it's sheer desperation. My humor can be broken up. Sometimes it's straight whimsy. I wrote Canada's history backwards once, and then I did a piece just on Victoria freaking out in a snowstorm, just because it's funny. And you say, where do those come from? I tell the truth, I don't know. Satire, on the other hand, is almost closer to serious news reporting than it is to other types of humor. You're looking for the same things in satire as you are in a serious news story, and the gaps between how things are presented and how they really are. And it's funny, you look at the best satirists in Canada and in the world in general, and they're people who live on the edge. Look in Canada, who does the best satire in Canada? It's the This Hour Has 22 Minutes guys and Rick Mercer. They're all from Newfoundland. There's a couple of brothers, Ian and Will Ferguson. Ian lives in Victoria. And they wrote a book called How to Be a Canadian Even If You Already Are One. That kind of lampoons Canadian life, except they got their perspective from growing up way up north, at the very far north of Alberta, where it's like looking at the rest of the country from the bleachers. So things that people take for granted, they'll go, hold on, wait a minute. So that's where the satire comes from, is being able to sit back and go, hold on. There's an incongruity between how things are supposed to be and how they really are.
Any idea how many columns you've written over the years?
More than 4,000. Wrote my very first column 25 years ago. And I was the city editor at the Times Columnist, which is the boss of the reporters. And it's a meat grinder of a job. There's lots of tension and stress and conflict. So more for myself than anyone else, I decided to write something funny. And at the time, my wife made and sold hats at Christmas craft fairs. And they're the kind of fairs that women love and men hate. And I would go there with my wife, and you would see these guys just lurching and moaning and groaning like they were extras from The Walking Dead. I thought, man, these guys look miserable. So I wrote a column about how I was going to get a flatbed truck, pull it up outside the craft fair, and have a beer garden with barbecue where you could cook red meat and a big screen to show hockey fights. That was my first column, and it went over, and they said, write another one. So wrote another one, and that went well, and I kept on doing a weekly humor column until the year 2000, and then started writing columns full-time.
Do you have a favorite?
I have a favorite story. This was more of a feature than a column. I love going places where I would never otherwise go and meeting people who I would never otherwise meet. A dictionary of Indigenous language plopped on my desk one day. It was of Nechanoth. And I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. I know nothing about this topic at all. So I phoned the author, And he said, there's a guy you should meet. He's up past Zabalas in a little place called Ukliji. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. That looks out towards Nootka Island. His name's Albin Michael, and he's the very last person on earth to speak his language. So went up and met him, and he was a fascinating guy, a really gentle soul. He said he'd had a dream just before I got there in which his parents were there, and they all conversed in their language, in Nuchatlet. And he woke up and he thought, that's the only place I can have a conversation in my own languages, in my dreams. That story got me, and I spun it into a longer piece on the state of Indigenous languages on Vancouver Island. But again, that was a guy I would never run across in my normal day-to-day orbit, and that's what I love about journalism, is you get a license to poke your nose in other people's business.
What was the column or story, good or bad, that got the most reaction, good or bad, from your readers? Emails, phone calls, that kind of thing. See you at the grocery store. Jack.
Oh, yeah. Early on, I wrote one. I thought it was hilarious about cats and dogs and how about dogs were better than cats. And I'm going to clarify right now, I like cats. Cats are awesome. Their owners are nuts. Sorry if you're a cat owner, but you're nuts. I got flamed on that one. Sometimes you write a column and you think, okay, I'm going to get hammered on this one. And nothing. It's like throwing a rock into a lake and having it disappear without a ripple. And then sometimes stuff comes flying out of the blue and you go, wow, were they mad? And how did they read that into that?
So do you have a dog or a cat?
No longer. I used to have the world's first perfect dog. I had a golden retriever named Spot. Tell you the truth, after Spot left, I thought, can't improve on perfection, and we haven't had a dog since.
You've written 4 books. There's Hard Knocks, Musings from the Edge of Canada, Opportunity Knocks, On the Rocks with Jack Knox, and the latest Fortune Knox Once. Must be great to have a name that you can just work into the titles like that. A guy named McCully isn't going to work.
I know. I'm sorry. You're hoop, pal. It's funny. I've yet to title one of my own books. Somebody else at the publishing house has come up with them and come up with kind of a punny name each time. I guess I can keep writing books until they run out of puns. I always say my wife had a long Italian name, and I think the only reason she actually married me was for the short signature.
Tell me about being told not once but twice that you've been longlisted for the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humour. Is that by chance a funny story?
Only if you think a guy having a big ego is funny. I wanted that nomination. I grew up reading Eric Nichol columns in the Vancouver province. He was the funniest columnist Canada ever had. And Eric Nichol won the Leacock Medal for Humour, and he was the guy I thought, man, that would be great if I could do that someday. I saw the original list go in, and there were 80 or 180 names on the list, and I checked because I wanted this. And yeah, there I was on the day the nominations came out. I just went online and checked, and there I was, and I nonchalantly phoned up absolutely every single person in my contact list and told them I had been longlisted for the Leacock Award. Now, I didn't get shortlisted, but I did get longlisted twice, and that felt good.
I bet. Political humor is always interesting, mostly I think because some people and some politicians don't necessarily always get it, or perhaps they just take it a little too seriously.
That's right. Smart politicians, even if they don't get it, they pretend they do. You look at the way politicians react, and it's kind of telling. When This Hour Has 22 Minutes first came on the scene, it was something that a lot of them hadn't seen before. And smart guys like Jean Chrétien would just dive right in and embrace it and go along with the joke. The ones who fought it just looked bad. You'd have, remember Marg Delahunty? It was Mary Walsh in costume, and you could go two ways when she came charging at you in the scrum in Ottawa. You could either go along with the joke or you could get huffy. And if you got huffy, people thought, oh, that guy's no fun at a party. I do not like Donald Trump. Do not like what he stands for. I don't care. I'm not a partisan guy at all. I just thought Donald Trump's a skunk of a human being. And I went after him a lot. And in reply, Trump fans would go after me. And I had one guy write and go, we're going to hunt down people like you and hang you, and I'm going to help build the guillotine. And I wanted to write back and go, I think you mean gallows, but decided not to poke the bear.
Did you take a different tact with your humor during the pandemic?
Yeah, I did. Here's the longish answer. I believe in the value of journalism. I particularly believe in the value of local journalism, which I've always compared to a neighborhood pub where people with different perspectives and opinions and backgrounds can get together and have a beer and talk things out. It's where we grow to understand each other. These days, I worry about everybody drifting off to silos that are echo chambers where they just hear their own voices bouncing back at themselves. One of the things I think we have a responsibility to do is not be unrelentingly negative. If you just get buried in the nasty stuff in the news, you can get a skewed view of reality, and it's like a fire hose coming at you all the time. So I've always believed, we need to balance the light and the dark. There's lots wrong in the world. There's also a lot that's good. The tension got made worse during the pandemic. Last 2.5 years, there's been so much tension, so much fear and angst. I really thought it was necessary to present humor. We need to laugh. We need to lighten up. We need to take a bit of the air out. People are so angry these days, though, that might have to do with the Canucks losing their first 7 games of the year or whatever.
Or their favorite mayor being tossed out of office.
Yeah, that's right. So, I had made a conscious attempt to seek humor where I could find it and try to lighten the load. There's got to be a purpose to doing what we're doing, and we're trying to make better communities, not burn them down.
When Today in BC continues, we'll talk with Jack Knox about some of the stories in his latest book, Fortune Knox Once.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. I'm Peter McCully. Let's talk about some of the stories that folks will find in your new book. For instance, I wouldn't have guessed you for a guy who participates in fun runs.
Yeah, to clarify, I am not. I was forced into doing fun runs. My wife is a serious runner. She actually just finished the Victoria half marathon. She turned 65 next month, and she's still running half marathons. And I was proud as she came up the hill in this last one. I always stand at the top of the steepest hill, and as she comes up, I yell, "What's for supper?" She's in on the joke, but usually the people around her just look horrified. But I wrote that in the 10K, I wanted to set a best time, but my best time is how late can I sleep in?
I found the story in the book about the poll that said Canadians have the 13th sexiest accent in the world. Friggin' hilarious. I come from a place where there's probably 60 accents within a 100-mile radius. And I really like the opening line in that particular story. She nuzzled my ear, say, "Roll up the rim to win."
Oh, yeah, that's us. Who's sexier than a Canadian? I look in the mirror and go, who is sexier than that? Yeah, no. I think you made a great point, and it's something I did put in that piece. What's a Canadian accent? Almost 1/4 of us are born outside the country. Probably about the same proportion. I think it's about 20% speak French, a different language entirely. Newfoundlanders, you're going to tell them that their accent isn't the Canadian accent? I will happily listen to anyone who tells me I am sexy in any degree at all, but come on.
You came up with your own version of the census, Jack's census, the census we want to fill out.
Don't tell me how many people live where or, how many farmers there are. I want to know what's your greatest regret. Put that on the census form. Or else put in there, have you ever cheated on your spouse? And then you put it, but we'll keep it confidential. And then the next line says, no, we're not keeping it confidential. You want it confidential, give me $50. Stuff like that. I want the juicy stuff in the census.
I was surprised to read that after your stop in Regina at the Leader Post, where you curled that particular winter, you didn't curl again for 20 years. What happened?
Went curling in Victoria in a bonspiel, and we said, okay, we need somebody who really knows what they're doing. So we brought in the business editor, Darren Closter, who's farm boy from Lucille, Saskatchewan. We get to the curling rink, and he goes, I don't curl. What do you mean you don't curl? I think he must have been deported to BC because he couldn't curl. I think in Victoria, there's maybe 2 or 3 curling clubs, but there's got to be half a dozen lawn bowling There's your difference.
I wouldn't have guessed you for a Justin Bieber fan to the point where you were thinking about actually becoming a social media influencer.
Not just a social media influencer, but a youth social media influencer.
There's the difference.
Hey, fellow kids. I'm the guy that they drag out to career day at schools, and they put me at a table by the entrance, and some counselor points at me and goes, "Do not follow this path. Look what can go wrong. Stay in school, kids. Study harder." The thing that gets me with social media influencers, though, is that, okay, they can make a bucket of money just by a tweet or a social media post. And I'm fine if you want to use your celebrity and stand up in a commercial and go buy these widgets. Fine. Everybody knows it's a commercial. You're being paid for it. But the idea that you can just slip a mention into the conversation, but actually have it as a paid opinion or whatever, that's sketchy to me. Of course, if you offer me enough money, I'd happily dive in myself.
How are you doing with technology these days? You and I are about the same age, and I know during the pandemic, everybody upgraded their laptops and their streaming services and the size of their television sets.
Okay, we got a new television set, and okay, we'd had the old television set that we got as a wedding present, and it just would not die. And I was at the point where I would have to see the score of the hockey game. I'd have to lean right into the screen until my eyebrows crackled with static electricity. And finally, we got rid of this thing and got in this beautiful, beautiful big television. My wife was rocking back and forth going, "Oh no, it's too big for the room. It's too big for the room." And I said, "There'd be more room if you left." But apparently that was the wrong thing to say. Hooking it up was something else. Hooking it up was just like the pandemic. I never want to go through that again. I even get flummoxed by smoke alarms. I actually had to replace one. There was a battery went off at 3 o'clock in the morning one day, and I had to replace the battery with a shotgun, and then the police came. We've got a smoke alarm now where we don't have an alarm, but this lovely posh British woman's voice comes along and goes, "Smoke has been detected in the hallway. The alarm will sound. It's going to be loud." And I love her voice, so sometimes I just burn toast on purpose just to see if she'll enter the conversation.
After reading the story, I'm pretty certain you won the name game, Jack.
Jack Knox has a name? Yeah, it's about people with ordinary names that suddenly become infamous. There was a guy on Salt Spring Island who was happily going through life with the name Mike Tyson.
I knew Mike.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
He was the manager at the Ganges Village Market.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And suddenly people are coming up with their hands. I mean, you might remember the time when the boxer Mike Tyson bit Evander Holyfield's ear. So people are coming up to Mike Tyson on Salt Spring, holding their hands over their ears, going, "Don't bite me, don't bite me." There was a guy called Freddy Krueger in Victoria who actually even lived on Elm Street in Saanich for a while. But he seized it at Halloween. He would dress up as Freddy Krueger. He drove the airport bus, and he would drive it in costume. There are other people. I know that Elizabeth May, the novelist, got an awful lot of hate mail that was supposed to be for Elizabeth May, the politician. There was also a defense lawyer in Vancouver with the same name as Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps, and she couldn't believe how nasty the stuff was. Aaron O'Toole, when he was named Conservative leader, all his tweets were going to a woman in Colorado who was a radio host. And she's going, "I'm not a Canadian politician." And people were still replying, "Yeah, never mind. What do you feel about Quebec dairy subsidies?" Jack Knox, I've actually got some okay people. There's a Scottish painter. There is a dog trainer. There was an FBI agent who went after domestic terrorists, which I thought was pretty cool. And then one day I got this glowing review from a reader saying, "I love your book." And I'm going, "Yes, that's awesome." And then I realized there's another Jack Knox who writes books. So I accepted his praise with modesty.
When your mother turned 100, you penned a story about your mom, who's now turning 102.
My mother turned 102 in September, and she's still here. She's failing. Any time with her now is bonus time. At the same time, my family and I think there's a pretty good chance that when the world ends, the last two people on earth will be my mother and Keith Richards. My mother was born at the end of the Spanish flu, and then she grew up like the rest of her generation with the Depression. Then when she turned 19, the Second World War broke out, and she saw all her friends go off to war. So you talk to her about the pandemic, she goes, this is just another crisis. Those of us who haven't lived through generational trauma might think that this is the worst thing that has happened in the history of the world. And she's going, yeah, you had to spend 6 months in your basement watching Netflix. Try 6 years of war and losing everyone you ever loved. So that's her message. The day she was born, Babe Ruth got a hit for the New York Yankees. She was born the year before Amelia Earhart started taking flying lessons. She was born 7 years before they first sold sliced bread, and before sunglasses and credit cards and chewing gum and all sorts of other things. And she just accepts what comes and just takes it in. And I'm going, if my mother can endure, so can we.
Did she ever share why she thought she's lived to a ripe old age of 102?
I think she's just stubborn. She just will not quit anything. She quit smoking, and the only reason she quit smoking is she went to a hypnotist. She spent money on a hypnotist, and it didn't work. And the idea of wasting the money bothered her so much that she just quit smoking anyway.
Who's been the source of your greatest inspiration over the years for columns? Biggest supporter, mentor, role model?
I'll go back actually to Mel Rothenberger in Kamloops, my very first editor, and he was the guy who set the bar. He modeled different people. There's a guy in Fortune Knox Once who died a few years ago. His name's David Graham. He was a school principal in Victoria. The guy who delivered the eulogy said, look, some of us show the best of ourselves some of the time. David showed the best of himself all of the time. He was just a good human being. So I try to model myself after him, David and my dad. As a journalist, as a columnist, I grew up reading Eric Nicol, loved Eric Nicol, and Jim Taylor. Jim Taylor was a big supporter of mine. He was the old sports columnist for the Sun of the Province, and he was a cheerleader of mine when I was writing Humour, and I appreciated that. I liked reading Alan Fotheringham when I was growing up. I liked his acerbic wit, Marjorie Nichols, people like that. They didn't know me.
We knew them.
Yeah, that's right. Jody Patterson was a columnist at the Times Colonist. And what I liked about Jody was her open mind. She'd do her research, do her homework, and her opinions would be based on what she discovered. She wasn't looking for facts to fit a certain viewpoint. She was also my sounding board. I'd say, Jody, am I being an idiot? And she'd go, yes, usually more politely than that. But you need somebody like that to be the goaltender standing between you and the rest of the world.
In your spare time, you play in a rock and roll band, I understand, with members of your Tour de Rock cycling team. So I need to know the story here. Tell me about this.
As musicians, we make pretty good cyclists. It's true, I rode the Tour de Rock 15 years ago, and it gave me a sense of accomplishment that I hope to never feel again. No, it was a great experience. 4 guys from the team, 2 Victoria cops, Andy Dunstan and Alex Yellowbats, Ed Bain, of radio and TV fame, and Bill Fry, the owner of the Trek bike store in Victoria. We all got together. 4 of us had been riders on the team. Andy had been a trainer of the team. And we got together, put a band together to do fundraisers to support Tour de Rock. But we've just been having fun. We've been together for longer than the Beatles, just a bit better than they were. We have a ton of fun. We play old guy rock and roll. The band is called Big Font because that's what we need to read the music now. I play a dumbed down bass guitar. I am the least able musician in the band, but I am also the eye candy. Well, it's just so obvious.
Do you plan on retiring, Jack? How do you feel about it?
I am inching towards retirement. I'm getting there. Not because I don't love what I do, because I do. I'm still enjoying it very much, and I'm in a privileged position for which I am profoundly grateful. But you only get one life. When I say I'm thinking about retirement, I really mean I'm thinking about doing something else. It's just you only get so many opportunities to do different things. Who knows what's next, but there will be something next.
For anyone listening to this at some point in the future, is there any wisdom you'd like to pass on to them, what you'd like them to know about being a writer?
I tell people 2 things. Write when there's inspiration, and that's particularly true with humor. Adrian Rayside, the cartoonist, will say the same thing. If you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you've got an idea, don't write it down on a notepad and get it in the morning. Just get up and get at it. And I'll do that. If I get an idea at 3 o'clock in the morning, I jump out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and let me tell you how much my wife likes that. But write when you've got the inspiration, because the moment can disappear. At the same time, when you don't feel like writing, discipline yourself. Don't get distracted. Don't use it as an opportunity to do the washing and walk the dog. Focus. The best advice I got on column writing came from Jim Taylor, who got it from Eric Nickel. And he said, some days all you got in you is garbage. Just give them the best garbage you got. Do your best, hit deadline, move on.
I'd like to thank Jack Knox, author and columnist, for being with us on this edition of Today in BC. If you have suggestions or comments, send us a voice message to podcast@blackpress.ca. You may be part of our podcast mailbag segment. You'll find Today in BC podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, and Google Podcasts.